We've spent time talking about the different types of messages that are out there. And today, what we're really going to talk about is how to create effective messages. And there are going to be two parts to this. There's going to be the video lecture for today, and then there will be a PowerPoint slide with some examples that you can read through. So why does this even matter? So effective messages really come from consistent planning and kind of a positive or other person oriented tone. And that sometimes is something that we don't think of originally, right? I've seen many students that they constantly are writing I this and I that. But we want to, as we get through this, you're going to see that you really want to think about your audience and how to be a more effective writer for your audience. These concepts that we're going to talk about, they are useful in every type of writing, whether it's text messaging, whether it's emails, or even formal or written reports. All right. So the goal here is we are going to try to be more influential as we are audience centered. So when writing, and I'm sure that you heard this in high school, but we want to plan, we want to write, and then we want to review. And in this process, the planning process really should be the bulk of your time. Take the time to understand who your audience is and to gather the right information in order to create a message that actually achieves your end goal. Then, once you get into that writing aspect, this is where you are going to set the tone that you want the paper or the message to take. You need to apply clear and concise style, so it has to be very understandable. And then focus on making it directional, right? So it has to flow nicely. Once you're done with that, you want to make sure that you are reviewing. Go back and double check everything. And I am sure that you've heard 100 times the idea of proofreading, checking for spelling errors and grammar errors, but it's more than that. You're also going back and you're looking for, does this actually portray the message that I'm trying to get across? Does it reach my end goal? And does this meet the needs of my audience? And that is very, very important. All right. So, oops, sorry, we missed one. The process here is really not quite as linear as this last slide shows, right? It looks like we plan, we write, we review, but the reality is that we plan, we're going to write some, we're going to realize we don't quite have everything we need, we're going to go back to plan, we're going to write some more, we're going to review, realize we're still missing something, go back to plan, right? And so you're going to actually go back and forth through this as many times as you need before you actually achieve that end goal. So, expert writers really do a great job of analyzing the needs of their audience and understanding that end goal. And then generating whatever the best idea is to try to tackle that problem and to come up with a solution or an actionable goal. It's important that you identify the primary message, but really focus in on those key points before you ever actually start to write. So here is kind of an aha moment. Okay. So there are some of you in this class right now that are poor writers. You think about it for half a hot second, you write it, and you never look at it again. Most of you are going to be average writers where you're going to spend a little bit of time planning. You're going to take a really long time to do all the writing, and you're going to do a really quick preview or proofread where you're checking spelling, grammar, maybe some formatting, and that's about it. What our goal is to help move you guys closer to that excellent writers section. And this is something that is going to develop over time, but we're going to start the process here in this class. And what this is you want to spend half, about half of your time in the planning process. Then you're going to write. All right. And if you look here, the writing as an excellent writer is actually about the same as the writing as a poor writer. The difference is so much more planning has gone into it. You know exactly what to say and how to say it. Then you're going to go back and you're going to review. And it's not just reviewing the spelling and the grammar. It's not just reviewing the formatting, but it's also reviewing the actual writing itself. Is this audience centered? Is this written in a tone that gets my point across? Is this written in a way that is going to be actionable in order to achieve the goal? And so, as you go through and review, not only are you reviewing for the spelling and the grammar, but you're also reviewing for the content. And that is the difference. So, the process is one that is focused on three areas. Okay. So, as we are actually planning, we want to make sure that we do an audience analysis, understand who our primary and our secondary audience is, and how does this message um, focus on them specifically. Then we're going to gather the information that we need in order to discuss or present the information to that audience, both primary and secondary. And then we're going to develop that message. So AIM stands for audience analysis, information gathering, and message development. Goodness. I'm pushing all kinds of buttons here, folks. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So, audience analysis, this is where you're going to think about the needs, the priorities, and the values of your audience members. Okay. Now, with our audience, we have a primary and a secondary audience. Our primary audience is who we are speaking to directly. So, for example, let's say that you are working on a project and you need to ask your manager a question about the project. He or she would be your primary audience. Now, if that question needs to be looked at by committee members, they would be your secondary audience. You're not discussing it directly with them, but they need to be part of the process. If someone needs to approve a financial increase, then your secondary audience becomes that financial institution or that investor. And so, as you go through your writing process, you want to make sure that you're keeping in mind what the priorities and the needs and the values of both primary and secondary audiences are. Identify reader benefits and their constraints, consider reader values and priorities, estimate personal credibility, right? How much are they going to believe what you're actually telling them versus how much they are not? And do you need to supply some additional research or peer-reviewed information to add credibility? Anticipate their reaction. This is a big one. Anticipating how they're going to respond to your message allows you to confront issues before they arise. So you're answering their questions before they have a problem with it. That gives you credibility in its own right. And then consider that secondary audience. Okay. All right. So identifying reader benefits and constraints. So for a lot of your messages, this really is the most important part of the planning process. You need to understand what is the benefit that the reader is actually getting or the audience is actually getting and what's holding them back from being able to make those decisions. As you're able to supply information toward those benefits or answer questions toward those constraints, it's going to increase your prospects for being able to complete whatever the project is. Um, all right. Okay, so considering reader values and priorities. So their values, um, their beliefs and ideas that individuals hold, right? So if I believe that we have to complete a project with as little waste as possible. If that is my belief as your audience, then as you're creating the project, you need to make sure that you take that into consideration. That's what that means. The priorities really involves ranking and assigning importance to things. So, for example, projects, goals, and tasks would all be prioritized according to what your audience thinks is the most important versus the least important, and then you would accommodate accordingly. So your community is going to make a big difference on how your audience views your information. All right. So your audience is the one that has to judge you as a credible source in order to approve your whatever your project is or whatever your statement is. As an entry level person, it is so common for you to come in with very, very low professional credibility. And basically it's because you're viewed as a newcomer and they do not see any um, um, experience that you already have. Okay. And most times you're going to come in with little to no experience. So always remember that and provide additional ways to prove credibility other than just your word. That really is the key component. How are you going to prove credibility other than just your word? All right, so ways that you can gain credibility. Set up a time to talk with your boss. So if you can talk to your boss one on one and really explain to them why you believe what you believe, then they're oftentimes going to increase your credibility. That'll increase your credibility. Ask your boss if you can take on any higher responsibility projects. Basically, this is about taking initiative and being willing to learn and experience new things in order to gain credibility by increasing your experience. Make sure you fit in with the corporate culture in terms of professional dress and communication style. Everybody wants to be an individual and everybody wants to be accepted for exactly who they are. But at the end of the day, you also have to be able to meld or mesh with the cultural, corporate culture. And so this may mean that you have to dress in a way at work that you don't normally dress outside of work. You have to communicate in more of a proper tone versus maybe when you're out with your friends, you use more slang, right? So it's really just about being able to intermingle appropriately in a professional manner with your coworkers. Attend a lot of meetings to get to know as many colleagues as possible. If people don't know who you are, then they can't get to know you. They can't know what you're good at and what you're not good at. They can't see that you're trying to gain experience. So you want to make sure that you are part of as many meetings as you can be. If there is a meeting and they say it is optional, you always go to it. That way you can get to know, network, and see what more you can learn. Create a professional blog about a niche area. This one's really optional. This is kind of as we get into these younger crowds, these newer businesses like Google, for example, they utilize a professional blog pretty often. Um, LinkedIn is another area that you can create a professional blog, and it allows you to network outside of your own personal employment. But make sure that you're using it in a way that is appropriate. So you never want to say something negative or bash the company you're working for. You always want to make sure that you are looking to increase your experience in order to increase your expertise. Okay. Networking is a key component here. All right, so a couple of tips for anticipating reactions. Really, what you're trying to do is you're trying to think about how others are going to respond to the message that you put out there. You want to think about how the reader is going to think, how they're going to feel, and really how they're going to act when they read it. A really good example of this is when you have to say something negative, right? When you're sending that bad news message, you need to realize and recognize, okay, what when I say this bad news, how are they going to respond? What are they going to do in retaliation, even? Right. So, how can you write in a way that's going to ease their emotions in order to make them feel seen and heard, and answer their questions and get to that end goal of keeping them as a customer long term or keeping them as an employee, right? Um, bad news is something we're going to cover completely separate, but really what you're trying to do with those bad news messages is make sure they understand whatever the answer, the negative news is, and then retain the relationship at the end of the day. When you're writing a report, you need to understand how your audience is going to respond to what you're recommending. For example, maybe you're recommending something a little outside of the box. Why are they going to think it's outside of the box? And how can you bring them into the box with you, right? Um, so those are just different ways to anticipate reaction. Uh, Again, we talked about this earlier, but really make sure that you're keeping that secondary audience in mind. They aren't. going to necessarily be the first person reading it. Obviously, that's not who you're sending it to, but they could still be reading it later. This really comes into play, especially if you're writing to, let's say, a coworker of yours is also one of your teammates on a project, and you guys have a tendency to talk in slang, especially outside of work, but you really want to still keep all of your messages professional in work, because what if your friend, right, or your teammate has to then forward that message on to management? Well, management doesn't need to see all the slang. It's not appropriate. It's going to make you look very unprofessional, regardless of the relationship that you have outside of work with the original or the primary audience. And what if that manager then has to send the information off to a financial institution? And it's not just them, right? There are lots of other people that can be involved in a secondary audience. And so you just always want to keep your messages very professional. All right. As you gather information, there are a couple of components. You want to identify the business's problem. Okay. You want to analyze what their problem is, and then you want to clarify the objectives, right? So, what are you actually trying to achieve in order to solve the problems? Excellent business thinkers are going to clearly and precisely identify and articulate what key questions and problems are. So, really just being able to describe them in a way that everyone would be able to understand. Gather the information from various sources. So, as you are trying to figure out how to solve that problem, you're not just going to one source and saying, that's the answer, right? You want to go to many different sources and determine what the best answer is for your specific problem, understanding that there are lots of different ways to solve one problem. Make well reasoned conclusions and solutions. So, you have to really justify why you came to the solution or the conclusion that you did. Remain open to alternatives. There is always more than one approach to a problem. There's more than one way to solve a problem in most cases. And so being open to those different ideas, those different reasonings, is going to help give you a broader selection of ways to solve the problem, which is in turn going to give you better problem solving abilities. Um, Excellent business thinkers are also very skilled at communicating with others to figure out and to solve complex problems. And here again, it's about keeping an open mind, being understanding that there's more than one way to solve a problem, and that someone else's idea, whether you decide to use that idea or not, could trigger new ideas that will be better. So always, always be a good communicator and a good listener. All right. So as we identify and analyze those business problems, we're really looking for the facts, the conclusions, and the positions. So the facts, that's really the statements that can be relied on with a fair amount of certainty and can be observed objectively. So this is the facts and nothing but the facts, right? There's no opinions in there, there's no bias. It's just this is the information that we have. Conclusions are statements that are reasoned and deducted based on the facts. So, based on the fact that only 2 out of 20 people drink the diet soda out of the vending machine, we can conclude that not very many people like diet soda, right? At our workplace. The positions is a stance that you take based on a set of conclusions. So perhaps in this case, the stance is that you propose or you believe that you should change the diet soda out for something that more people in the office will drink. Okay. So that is how we go through that. Clarifying your objectives. Once you've gathered your information, you're analyzing all of your information, you also need to clearly identify your goals. It's not just about having information. We have to understand what we plan to do with that information or where we need to get to at the end of the day. So, this is going to help you to decide how hard to push for specific positions that you're holding on an idea, but it also helps to balance out the outcomes as you're going through everything. All right. So with message development, the first thing is that we are going to frame the priority message. What is the primary message? What simple, vivid statement captures the essence of what your message is, right? I know and you know that there are people who can talk for days and days and days about one simple concept, giving you every single detail. But what if you had to take all of that information and put it into 1 to 2 sentences? That's what this is saying. You want to frame your main idea or your main message into something that can be very simple to understand. Then you're going to set up the logic of your message. So, what is your supporting evidence? All right. What do you want to explicitly ask your readers to do? What are you trying to, what is the action that you want them to take? And then how will you order the logic of your message? So, as you're actually putting that information out there, what makes sense to be the most important first thing that they're going to read? What is the second most important? The third most important? So, how are you going to actually order that information in order to give you a strong conclusion? All right. So, most business arguments employ a direct or deductive approach. This is very, very common. So, what does that mean? That means that they begin by stating the primary message, then they lay out all of the supporting reasons and the conclusions with a call to action. Makes sense, right? So, this is what my message is. This is why this is what my message is. And this is what I want you to do about it. In some cases, however, and a very good example of this is a bad news message, you will typically deliver things, well, like bad news as an indirect or inductive approach. Okay. And this is what that means. Basically, you are going to start with your reasoning, right? Supporting evidence first, followed by the bad news or the primary message, okay? And then you are going to add in some kind of a goodwill gesture or comment, okay? And that is all about trying to maintain the relationship despite the bad news. Again, we will get into much more detail on bad news later in the semester. All right. So, what does this framework typically look like when you are writing out your structure? Okay. So, first we have our primary message, right? That is your very first paragraph, if you will. Then you have your key point number one and its supporting evidence. Key point number two, its supporting evidence. Key point number three and its supporting evidence. You can think about this as key point one with its supporting evidence is paragraph number two. Key point two with its supporting evidence is paragraph number three. Key point three with its supporting evidence is paragraph number four. And then finally is your call to action. So, what is it that you need to do now? Which is going to be like your paragraph number five. Okay. This is also called a mind map, where you're actually just kind of writing down and thinking through what you want this to look like. This I highly encourage you to do. It does make things a little bit easier as you continue to move forward in the writing process. All right, so here's just a very simple deductive format for a business message. You can see here we have that opening paragraph talks about the primary message, and just kind of a preview of what your key points are. Then you've got the body, which includes your key points, and then it's supporting evidence in each one of those paragraphs. These paragraphs are going to be anywhere from 3 to 5 sentences long. Remember, we don't want to be super wordy. We want to be clear and concise. And then the concluding paragraph is going to restate that primary message and then gives you that call to action. And I cannot stress to you enough how important that restating the primary messages. Sometimes when people read an email, for example, they'll read the subject line and the last paragraph. They just want it quick and simple. And if they need more information, then they go back up into the details. It's so common to see business people read that way. So it's important that you restate your primary message in that conclusion and then give your call to action so they know what you're talking about when you talk about that call to action. And then again, they can go back up and see those key details. All right, so that is all that I have for message structure today. There is another PowerPoint for you to look at that's actually going to give you some writing ideas and how to improve your actual writing. So be sure to take the time to go through and read through those examples in that PowerPoint. Thanks, guys, and have a great day. Bye.